Today I want to talk to you about discerning the voice of God. And are you expecting to hear God speak? In the Bible we see where God spoke to Abraham, He spoke to Moses, He spoke to the prophets, and He spoke the world into being. And He wants to speak to you as His child. In fact, Jesus said in John 8:47, "He who belongs to God hears what God says. The reason you do not hear is that you do not belong to God." So I want to walk you through 3 steps to position yourself to discern God's voice, because the chances are you are hearing from God, but you're also hearing from an enemy presence, and so we need to learn to discern between God's voice and the enemy's voice. So I want to walk you through the first step, which is to ask God to bind the enemy. And I'm going to read to you from Genesis chapter 3, where God had spoke to Adam and Eve and said, "Do not eat from the tree in the garden." And then Satan came disguised as a serpent, telling Adam and Eve to eat from the tree. And so I'm going to just start in Genesis 3, verse 1, and read to verse 4. "Now the serpent was more crafty than any of the wild animals the Lord God had made. He said to the woman, 'Did God really say you must not eat from any tree in the garden?' The woman said to the serpent, 'We may eat fruit from the trees in the garden, but God did say you must not eat fruit from the tree that is in the middle of the garden, and you must not touch it or you will die.' 'You will not surely die,' the serpent said to the woman, 'for God knows that when you eat of it, your eyes will be opened, and you will be like God, knowing good and evil.'" Now, the rest of the story goes on to say that they did eat from the tree, and then in their guilt and condemnation, they hid from God. It further goes on to say that they didn't ask for forgiveness for their mistake. They just blamed it on each other. So I want to take you to step 1 and just talk about that a little bit more. Step 1 is to ask God to bind Satan. So it's just like this, okay? "God, will you please bind the enemy in every way around me?" That word bind is to bound up, okay? So to silence the enemy. So you're going to ask God to silence the enemy, bind the enemy, stop all activity of the enemy, however you want to ask. But then you're going to listen for God's spirit voice. God is spirit. We're told in the story of the woman at the well that God is spirit. True worshipers will worship Him in spirit and in truth. His voice is a spirit voice. So you're just going to listen to God's spirit voice in the answers that you're going to be looking for in these steps. And His voice, His spirit voice sounds like your spirit voice. Your spirit voice is your silent prayer voice, okay? So it's not some voice out here that you can hear or anybody near you can hear. It's a voice that you hear within you as God speaks to you. And again, it sounds like your silent prayer voice. Okay, so you're just going to ask God to bind the enemy, and then you're going to listen for His spirit voice answer. And he'll say something like, "Yes, the enemy's bound." Okay, if you don't hear that, that's okay, because there's more steps, and we need to go through all of those steps before you understand how it is that you position yourself to hear God. I want to talk to you about testing the spirits. As we've just said, God has a voice, and Satan has a voice, enemy presence has a voice. So you're going to test the spirits as found in 1 John 4, 1 through 3, and I'm reading from the NIV translation here. "Dear friends, do not believe every spirit, but test the spirits to see whether they are from God, because many false prophets have gone out into the world. This is how you can recognize the Spirit of God. Every spirit that acknowledges that Jesus Christ has come in the flesh is from God. But every spirit that does not acknowledge Jesus is not from God. This is the spirit of the Antichrist, which you have heard is coming, and even now is already in the world." So you're going to ask the question aloud, because enemy presence cannot read your mind. God can read your mind, but you want to hear if there's an enemy presence there. So you're going to ask the question, "Did Jesus Christ come in the flesh?" And you're going to listen for that answer. So I'm going to ask the question and show you. Did Jesus Christ come in the flesh? And I heard absolutely yes, from God's spirit voice, okay? So that's how it should sound. Now I'm going to give you some time to digest this section 1 before we move on to section 2. Okay, in part 1 of this video, we were learning how to position ourselves to hear God speak, and the first step was to ask God to bind the enemy, because the enemy has a voice, and the enemy wants to come and bring deceit and lies to us. So in step 1, we ask God to please bind the enemy in every way around us. The second step then is to have a brief forgiveness conversation with God. And I want to remind you of the story that we listened to in step 1, which was in the garden in Genesis chapter 3, where God said not to eat from the tree, and then Satan convinced Adam and Eve to eat from the tree. And then they hid from God. And God was then, after they hid from God, and then they blamed each other. Adam said, that woman you put here, she caused me to eat from the tree. And Eve said, the serpent caused me to eat from the tree. Neither of them came to God and said, God, I'm sorry, I made a mistake. I should have come to you and asked you what to do. And neither of them did that. They didn't ask for forgiveness. So a lot of times that's what's keeping you from being able to hear God and have relationship and fellowship with God, is because you haven't gone to God and said, God, please forgive me. So step 2 then is just to have a brief forgiveness conversation with God. And you can make this as long as you want, but for the purposes of learning to discern God's voice, I usually tell people just to have a brief forgiveness conversation here and then go home and have a more intimate conversation with God about it. But the question is just this: God, is there anything I need to ask forgiveness for? And you're going to listen for God's spirit voice, and it'll sound like your own silent prayers, and some people say it sounds like their own thoughts. But when you ask that question, if a thought comes in your mind of something that you know that you've done that was outside of God's will or intentionally disobedient to God, then you're just going to have a conversation with God like this: God, I'm sorry. Will you show me how to do this differently the next time? Okay? God honors that. He sees that you're humbling yourself and you're putting yourself back under God's authority. These are the ways that you may give away spiritual authority to the enemy. Any type of intentional disobedience to God, where you knew that you were supposed to do something in one way and you intentionally did it a different way. Like Adam and Eve when they ate from the tree in the garden. Any kind of occult practice, anything that palm reading, horoscopes, fortune telling, anything that is calling on supernatural powers other than God, okay? Then that is a way that you're going to give authority over to the enemy. Also, any kind of false religions. I'm going to just give a partial list, but you know, there's any kind of false religion, false doctrine, false God, Mormonism, Jehovah's Witness, Masons, Christian Science, Islam, Hinduism, Buddhism, New Age, Unification Church. All of those are ways that you give away spiritual authority to the enemy. And so what you're going to want to do is ask God, just, God, would you please take back any spiritual authority that I've given away and help me to submit to you, okay? In James 4:7 it says, submit yourselves to God and resist the devil and he will flee. It's not just resist the devil. A lot of people forget the fact that they're supposed to submit themselves first to God, and then as submitted to God, they can resist the devil and he will flee. Okay, so that's part 2. I want to give you some time to digest that, and then we'll move on to step 3. In step 1, we learn to ask God to bind the enemy. In step 2, we learn to ask God for forgiveness and to take back any spiritual authority that we may have given away. Step 3 then is just to position yourself to actually listen to God lead you. Jesus said, my sheep will hear my voice and follow me. So I got this part of step 3 from Isaiah chapter 30, where it says, although the Lord gives you the bread of adversity and the waters of affliction, your teachers will be hidden no more. Whether you turn to the right or to the left, you'll hear a voice behind you saying, this is the way, walk in it. And so that's what we want to do. We want to listen to God, and we want to ask a simple question that we don't know the answer to. So it's just, God, do you want me to move right or left? Okay, so I'm going to ask that question. God, do you want me to move right or left? And I heard God in his spirit voice say to move to the right. So I'm going to move to the right and feel that peace of obedience that comes from obeying God. Okay, now the next part of this then is you can say to God, God, why did you have me move in that direction? And listen for the answer. So I'm going to do that. God, why did you have me move right? I just wanted you to give an example. Okay, so and by moving in the right direction. All right, so that is the simplest part of the process of learning to discern God's voice, is just asking him a question and listening for the answer. Now, if you've gone through step 1, asking God to bind the enemy, step 2, asking God to forgive you, part of that asking for God to take back any spiritual authority you've given away, and you're at step 3 and you still aren't hearing God, that could be because there is still an enemy presence around you, and the reason why that would be, and I want to cover that in the next step, but I want to talk to you in the next step about generational curses and satanic curses. But I want to read this part here, and we'll cover it again in the next step. The first commandment from God, from Exodus 20, reads, "You shall have no other gods before me. You shall not make for yourself an idol in the form of anything in heaven above, or on the earth beneath, or in the waters below. You shall not bow down to them or worship them, for I, the Lord your God, am a jealous God, punishing the children for the sin of the fathers to the 3rd and 4th generation of those who hate me, but showing love to 1,000 generations of those who love me and keep my commandments." So that would help you to understand why God would put a generational curse on a family. Okay, so we'll cover that after you've had some time to digest this. We'll cover that in the next step. So in step 1, we learn to ask God to bind the enemy so the enemy doesn't have a voice and that we would hear only from God. In step 2, we learned to ask God if there was anything we needed to ask forgiveness for, and to take back any spiritual authority that we may have given away to the enemy. Step 3 was just to learn to listen to God give us direction by asking God, should I move right or left, and listening for his answer. But what I want to talk about now is generational curses and satanic curses. Generational curses are put on unbelievers by God. This is not something that is a curse by the enemy. This is God doing this. And it's talked about in Exodus 20, which is the 10 Commandments. And the first commandment reads, "You shall have no other gods before me. You shall not make for yourself an idol in the form of anything in heaven above, or on the earth beneath, or in the waters below. You shall not bow down to them or worship them, for I, the Lord your God, am a jealous God, punishing the children for the sins of the father to the 3rd and 4th generation of those who hate me, but showing love to 1,000 generations of those who love me and keep my commandments." So a large part of spiritual war is knowing who God really is. And God says, I won't put up with any other gods being put in place of me. So that means that, just as I talked about the ways that you can give away spiritual authority, these false religions are not the one true God. They are, in fact, Satan setting himself up to be worshipped like the one true God. That's why Lucifer was thrown out of heaven. He wanted to be worshipped like God, and that's what he gets, that satisfaction when we worship false gods and false religions. So a generational curse can look like any kind of generational conflict. I'm going to give you some examples, but you're going to just ask God to break any generational curse that might be on you or your family line, and ask him to show you how to walk free of it, okay? Examples are addictions, homosexuality, divorce, transgender, gambling, promiscuity, mysticism, pornography, anything that you see in your family line that just keeps showing up generation after generation. Okay, and so you're going to ask God to break that generational curse and show you how to walk free of it. Okay, and that's a conversation that you want to take the time to listen to God about. Satanic curses come from Satan targeting you, but if it can be a person who has bowed their knee to Satan, going to Satan and specifically asking Satan to target you. There are principalities. In the book of Daniel, we're told that the angel Michael had just come back from fighting against the prince of Persia. And what that means is that there are satanic forces over different principalities. So in your town, there may be a principality, a demonic principality, where there are evil spirits under Satan's authority, targeting you, coming and staying right in your house with you, and whispering lies and deceit. And that's why a lot of people commit suicide, because they have a demonic presence beside them, an evil spirit beside them, that has come to kill, steal, and destroy. And familiar spirits are the spirit of a deceased person who died outside of Christ, who may have very intimate knowledge of you, maybe someone who loved you while they were alive, but because they died outside of a relationship with Christ, they are now in that spiritual realm where Satan is, and they are considered an evil spirit, and they are under the power of Satan and demonic forces. So, but you're going to just ask God to break every chain and curse that the devil may have against you, and you're going to ask God to cause every lie that has been spoken over you to fall away. Okay? What I want you to realize is this is the gist of what spiritual war is. We either hear God, submit ourselves to His authority, or we are hearing from the enemy and submitting ourselves to the enemy's authority. And that tells you which side you're on. If you are submitting to the enemy through being your own God, through wanting your desire more than God's desire, more than God's will, then you are on the side of the enemy. And what you need to do is position yourself to be under God's authority, willing to submit even if it's uncomfortable, but wanting God's will above your will at all times. Thank you for taking the time to watch this teaching video. I pray that this will help you draw closer to God, that you will want His will, to seek Him, and just have that personal, intimate relationship with Him. My name's Tammy Edwards. I'm a deliverance minister, and I love to show people how to have this fellowship with God, how to know the difference between God's voice and the enemy's voice. I have more than 200 teaching videos on this YouTube channel, Kingdom Champions, and they are being watched in over 120 countries and in every American state. And I hope that you will be one of those viewers that tunes in and would love to have your feedback. In the precious name of Jesus, I pray for you today.